Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. In my humble opinion, nonsense in fiction can be a little fickle. There's a very fine line between delightfully random and inanely disjointed, and yet the great irony of it all is that, even at its most absurd, some of the best fictional nonsense still follows at least some rules in order to effectively tell its story. Perhaps nowhere is this truer than in the case of the granddaddy of literary nonsense, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. As silly as this book is, it still works partly because of the episodic format of its chapters. Moreover, smaller bits that are introduced but never fully explained, if at all, are acceptable because they are interesting enough to engage the audience while being minor enough to be abandoned without disrupting or ruining the overall narrative. That being said, there have been countless tales that have since attempted to further explore some of those bits. One tale in particular revolves around a single burning question. Just who exactly is Mary Ann, the servant girl for whom the White Rabbit had mistaken Alice? Tommy Kovac and Sonny Liu offer their answer in Wonderland, released as 6 single-issue comics beginning in 2006, and then compiled as a full graphic novel in 2008, and recommended for readers 13 and up. The inhabitants of Wonderland are still reeling from the chaos and destruction wrought by the creature now dubbed the Alice Monster. Indeed, the Queen of Hearts is in an even fouler mood than ever. But thanks to some hints from Tweedledee and Tweedledum, who are trying to weasel their way out of an execution, she now has the perfect scapegoat on which to vent her rage, her very own herald, the White Rabbit. After all, why was the monster trying so hard to find him? And just what exactly was she doing inside his house? As it just so happens, Mary Ann, the rabbit's obsessive-compulsive but unfailingly devoted housemaid, returns to her master just in time for the queen to brand the rabbit a traitor and give her infamous order, "Off with his head!" And now Mary Ann finds herself on the run along with him. As she strives to keep both their heads on their shoulders, Mary Ann comes to learn not only more about the notorious Alice Monster, but of the Curious, a mysterious cult that worships her, and who now wish for the similar-looking Mary Ann to finish what the monster began and dethrone the criminally insane queen once and for all, no matter how reluctant she is. Having been published by Disney Press, the art style of Wonderland is heavily influenced by that of Disney's animated film version of Alice in Wonderland. But the key difference between Liu's illustrations and the frames of the 1951 film is the former's much more visually blatant wackiness. Colors range from washed out to very bright, its patterns as erratic and unpredictable as many of the comic panel's shapes. The characters have highly exaggerated anatomies, with stick-thin limbs and huge bulbous heads and bodies. And this is even when they're not mutating from inhaling shrinking dust or sampling growth-inducing mushrooms. There's also Liu's sketchy outlines, which give the environment a very scratchy and squiggly appearance, both insubstantial and solid at once. This works especially well during some of the more action-filled scenes in that the ensuing chaos makes the characters appear even less physically defined than usual, further emphasizing the bizarre nature of this world. Along with all the original characters, like the proper, though paranoid White Rabbit, the devilishly cheery Cheshire Cat, and the tea-crazed March Hare and Mad Hatter, Kovac introduces us to some new ones, like the long-lost Queen of Spades. As skinny and serious as the Queen of Hearts is fat and fanatical, she provides much of the backward thinking and pun-filled wordplay that Carroll's work is known for, made all the more hilarious here because of her brutally blunt, stone-faced delivery, as if from a chronically irked Easter Island statue. Pages 70 to 71. If you're to be my maidservant now, you will have to learn a few simple rules of behavior befitting a girl of your station. First of all, you should slouch a bit and stand pigeon-toed. A proper lady-in-waiting is quiet and polite. When she must speak, she does so softly and keeps her mouth mostly shut. Have the decency to look at the ground and twiddle your thumbs nervously. When I call for silence, you shall bring me bushels and cartloads of it. I wish to acquire great storehouses of silence, so that I never run out of it. Skipping to page 76. Mary Ann gazes curiously at the King of Spades, who is sitting on a rock in drowsy silence a few feet away. "Why does your husband say nothing?"
she asks the Queen of Spades. "He is my mate. We share our thoughts, our dreams, our opinions, our voice, and right now I am using all those things." But our primary new character is our young protagonist. Part of what makes this story so fun are the many ways in which Marianne, arguably the most human resident in Wonderland, treats all the ridiculousness around her like just another day at work, as it were, while still portraying the kind of insanity that makes even the other Wonderlandians seem sensible by comparison. Her greatest quirk and weakness being her absolutely frenetic obsession with cleanliness. I think the White Rabbit puts it best when she gathers up all the filthy dishes from the Mad Tea Party for a dangerously good scrub with an immense beam on her face. Page 92. "Can't you do something about her?" asked the Queen of Spades, thoroughly annoyed. In a resigned tone, the White Rabbit answers, "It would be a shame to make her stop. She's so happy when she's scrubbing something to within an inch of its life." But it is through Marianne's reactions to Alice and her infamous deeds that Kovac really paints for us a picture of her character. It's almost as if, as soon as the White Rabbit admits his mistaking Alice for her, Marianne is cursed to be constantly compared to her in almost every way from that moment on, and not only because of her appearance. Pages 21 through 22. The Cheshire Cat leers at Marianne and the White Rabbit. "Seems you've been incriminated, Bunny Rabbit, for suspicious dealings with the Alice monster." The White Rabbit stammers. "But Monster? What's this about?" asks Marianne. His hands waving frantically, the White Rabbit explains. "While you were gone, there was an imposter here. She wrecked some of the rooms and shot the groundskeeper out of the chimney like a pea out of a pea shooter. I thought she was you at first." Marianne puts her hands to her chest, looking deeply hurt. "Thought she was me?" "Well, she was a girl like you, and was wearing some sort of dress, and she had some sort of hair on her head. I don't know. I suppose I was distracted at the time." Marianne looks at herself in the full-size mirror. "Am I that nondescript? I know I'm just a maid, but..." The more Marianne tries to distance herself from any association with such a troublemaking monster, the more we see how similar they really are to each other. Much like Alice, Marianne does her best to be reliable, honest, helpful, and obedient, but she also isn't afraid to speak her mind when she believes something isn't right. Plus, it really is funny to hear an insane person calling what we would consider a sane person insane. Try saying that 5 times fast. Pages 95 through 96. The Mad Hatter addresses Marianne and the White Rabbit, the latter frowning with his hands on his hips, while the March Hare pours himself another cup of tea. "You know, we had another young lady come by for tea just a little while ago. That was before she outgrew herself and ended up in court. Might she be a friend of yours?" "So, the Alice monster was here too, was she?" says the White Rabbit. The March Hare puts a sideways hand to his face. "You know, they say she's been sighted in Looking Glass House, but don't tell the Queen of Hearts. She has followers now, who call themselves the Curious." "Why would anyone follow a monster?" asks Marianne. Putting a hand to his chin, he answers. "There are those who quite like the way she called the Queen's Guard nothing but a pack of cards, and she's not afraid to call nonsense when she sees it." The Mad Hatter retorts. "Oh, poppycock! That would be like yelling sky every time you look up." Feather, Marianne's living feather duster, flies up as he chips in. "I think this Alice monster sounds more interesting all the time." Marianne responds angrily. "I think she sounds terrible and rude. If every girl were a back-talking, stuck-up little prat, Wonderland would be a jagged place indeed." Also like Alice, just because Marianne is a little girl subject to the whims of powerful, quote-unquote, adults, doesn't mean she appreciates insults to her intelligence and dignity. And just because she's a servant doesn't mean she is never curious about the world around her, wondering how it might shape her and her future. Even in a place where logic is said to have no place, she only wants what any other logical person would want, to be herself. Pages 118 to 119. Marianne and Feather wander the dust desert, making their way through the scattered and half-buried furniture. So, in this dream you had about the Alice monster, was she doing all sorts of savage, exciting things? Asks Feather. Marianne does her best to explain. Well, not really. It was both strange and dull at the same time. In her world, the animals all went about naked, and none of them talked at all. Even the flowers were silent. There were kings and queens, but they were just regular stupid gets. But Alice, lived in a big, beautiful house, and she had more pretty dresses than you can imagine. She never had to wash or mend or scrub the floors, and nobody told her what to do. At least, not much. And when they did, she didn't have to listen. She sounds spoiled. Boy, that'd be the life, eh? Feather remarks. Marianne tucks her hair behind her ear, looking thoughtful. I suppose. She had 2 sisters, and she was prettier than either of them. But she had nothing to do all day, except look at herself in the mirror and play with those creepy silent animals. Skipping to pages 124 through 125. Marianne looks at the ground glumly. The White Rabbit tries to encourage her. Oh, Marianne, I think you'd be delightful at rebellion. It would be so orderly and tidy. Marianne smiles gratefully at the White Rabbit. Thank you, Master Rabbit. That means a lot to me. And doesn't every girl want to be a queen or a princess? The White Rabbit asks. Marianne gazes into the distance with a small smile. I have my dreams, like any girl, I suppose. But I think I really just want to be humble little Marianne. As a side note, I kinda wish the title was different, as it doesn't feel very original, nor does it do its narrative justice in either description or engagement. But oh well. Truth be told, I personally wouldn't recommend readers getting into this graphic novel unless they've at least seen Disney's animated film beforehand. Although, I think being familiar with both the film and Carol's novel would help readers get the most out of it, because there are specific elements from both versions found throughout, and knowing those would help make the experience more enriching, and certain segments and cameos, for lack of a better way to put it, make more sense. Not unlike many contemporary stories based on fairy tales or century-old classics, Wonderland is much more plot-driven, with more fleshed-out and relatable characters than the story that inspired it. And yet it beautifully retains the poetic nonsense that made the original Alice so beloved. Liu takes the visual elements of Wonderland and exaggerates them even further. And Kovac very creatively expands on Carol's characters, especially one who was literally nothing but a name before, while not forcing too much unnecessary depth on them. If the Wonderland that came before has never been known to sweat details or take itself too seriously, then there's no reason why this one should, at least to an extent. And in the end, for all the right reasons, we don't have to care in the slightest.
Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you.
Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams.
I don't shy away from dystopian fiction in general, but some, especially movies, that feature apocalyptic plots or backdrops can often leave me feeling bored, depressed, or both. Think zombies, epidemics, global catastrophes, and the like.
Some I have enjoyed more than others. Children of Men had an intriguing end-of-the-world scenario and was actually pretty exciting. These are few and far between for me, though.
Upon watching this film, however, I realized that part of my aversion was due to the head-bashing reminder of the seemingly inherent ugliness of humanity that such stories seldom fail to bring up. While that implication isn't absent here either, it's made more bearable not only by a setting more aesthetically interesting, but by the fact that its protagonist has far more on his mind than just eat, sleep, have sex, kill, live another day, repeat. Let us now open The Seventh Seal, released February 16th, 1957, and recommended for viewers 17 and up. Antonius Block, a Swedish knight, and his squire, Jons, have fought 10 long, grueling years in the Crusades and are now at long last journeying home. But the Sweden they return to is not the one they remember. As the Black Plague ravages the land, most of those still alive are half mad with terror and despair, crying out to God for relief and mercy. Made all the more morose by such bleakness, Antonius finds temporary solace only in the chess matches he plays with himself. One night, during one such game, he is approached by a pale figure in a pitch-black cloak, none other than Death himself. Unwilling to die just yet, Antonius strikes him a bargain. They will play a single round of chess, allowing Antonius to live for as long as it lasts. But should he lose, he must surrender his life without question. And now, with those few precious days he has bought for himself, Antonius fights to find answers to the theological and existential questions that haunt him, before he leaves this hellish world for good. Having formerly studied more literature than cinema, I was previously unaware of how influential this film is to this day. While it didn't get nominated for the Best Foreign Language Film category for the 30th Academy Awards, it has still had an enormous impact on numerous filmmakers and actors alike, from Woody Allen to Monty Python. Considered by many critics to be on par with such greats as Citizen Kane, The Godfather, and Gone with the Wind, it not only cemented Ingmar Bergman as a legendary director, but has since become a staple in critical analysis and film study the world over. Many historians have noted The Seven Seals' historical inaccuracy. For example, flagellation, in which people would brutally whip themselves in penance for their sins, was never practiced in medieval Sweden, nor large-scale witch persecutions there in the 14th century. But this really doesn't matter, nor should it, because the plot of The Seventh Seal is intended as an allegory, an experience, its symbolism a reflection of our own modern lives and points of view. As a matter of fact, this movie feels less like a movie than it does an olden stage play. Incidentally, Bergman had directed some Shakespearean plays before making this film. What really stood out to me was the dialogue. Though not as heavy as that of Shakespeare, it is still very dramatic and poetic, delivered with so much beauty even when the words are at their most serious and dismal. So even if the lines feel scripted and unrealistic, the conviction behind them does not. The film's title is particularly significant, derived from chapter 8, verse 1 of the book of Revelation. Quote, "And when the Lamb had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven, which lasted about the space of half an hour." And it is this theme of silence that accounts for much of the seven seals' power. Not solely the absence of sound, though Bergman does utilize that very effectively. There is no music during either the opening or ending credits, for example, in order to set the proper tone of solemnity. And in one of my personal favorite segments, Jons tries to rouse a man lying against a rock in order to talk to him, only to find that he is actually shaking a hollow corpse. Upon Antonius's questioning, Jons never tells him straight out that the man is dead, but instead, and quite calmly, answers by complimenting the man's eloquence despite his story being most depressing. But the more crucial type of silence being addressed here is the perceived absence of God, namely, the idea that God ignores humanity, or worse, doesn't exist at all. Every person who has ever lived on this earth has wondered what the meaning of life is, and our protagonist is no exception. Though he is a valiant knight with his heart in the right place, Antonius feels no stronger, wiser, or purer than any other human being. Far from it. Having fought so long and so hard, having seen so much agony and death, he feels cold, bitter, and empty. Exacerbating these feelings is his desire to find some kind of meaning, however small, almost as though his existence up to now has been devoid of it. Never once has God appeared before him or given any other physical sign that he is indeed listening. This, according to Antonius, begs the question. Because man is so weak and blind and confused, why can't God show himself and actually give answers, instead of forcing man to struggle in body and in heart in trying to follow him? Touching back on the play comparison, I believe some of the characters represent a specific religious point of view, which drives their motivations and defines their personalities. In this sense, I'm reminded of characters from traditional legends and fairy tales, whose traits are meant to symbolize and teach us about some aspect of real life. Though this may paint them as somewhat one-dimensional, their own traits are similarly symbolic in ways that virtually any modern audience can understand and relate to, socially and psychologically. This is especially intriguing and illuminating when juxtaposed with Antonius's doubt and aching desire for spiritual truth. Johns, though a loyal servant and friend to his master, is cynical and filled with contempt for the church, the atheism to the knight's agnosticism. Just the concept of God strikes him as nothing but ludicrous crap. Fallen for by the gullible and desperate, manipulated by the pompous and greedy, and misconstrued by the sadistic and mentally unstable. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Joff, a traveling juggler. Though childish and naive, he is a kind and devoted family man to his wife, Mia, and their infant son, Michael. I think part of Joff's optimism stems from the fact that he has loved ones to return to, and that he knows will be there to support and comfort him, and vice versa. Unlike Antonius, whose own wife may or may not still be alive. But Joff also has the mysterious ability to see deities, like baby Jesus and the Virgin Mary, as they walk upon the earth. Or so he claims. Regardless, his unwavering faith in these visions strengthens his faith and inspires his dreams, no matter how far-fetched they may seem, and tells him that there is indeed both a point to life and life after death. But even though Antonius has little to look forward to, even without death literally waiting to take him, I don't find him as depressing as he could have been. Bergman provides him, and us, with some uplifting moments as well, without being overly silly or sentimental or ruining the film's somber atmosphere. There is a beautiful sequence in which Antonius and his party are offered strawberries and milk by Joff and Mia on a grassy hill. Partaking in this humble but pleasant meal, surrounded by the warmth of friends and summer, he holds up the bowl of milk in both hands and drinks from it as if receiving Holy Communion, and makes a heartfelt speech to match the reverence of the gesture. This is an extremely rare moment of the entire movie in which Antonius shows any genuine happiness. For all the sorrow in his heart, he has not lost the ability to appreciate the beauty and joy that life has to offer, even in an era of such horrific tragedy. Accordingly, he is deeply grateful to be a part of such a wonderful and precious moment. On the surface, The Seventh Seal may look like one of those highbrow artsy films that can only be enjoyed by either the scholarly or the pretentious. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Bergman uses religious allegories, heavy and complex though they may be, to reach audiences on a more universal and human level. I see it as neither a glorification nor a condemnation of Christianity exclusively, but rather as an exploration of spiritual crisis and how faith may or may not guide people in their personal walk of life. Though we will all meet death someday, how willingly we go in the end is as much a mystery as the Holy Spirit itself. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. It's a well-known, if unfortunate fact, that not all people make good parents. Even those with the best intentions may be unable, for whatever reason, to raise a child in a healthy manner. As much as I like kids and kids' stories, I have long since discovered and decided that, though I am many things, mother material is not one of them. Heck, taking care of a dog for a family friend while he was out of town for a week is the closest I've ever come to babysitting. In a way, the would-be parent in this novel reminds me of myself. I may not be a witch, but I also value my freedom to practice my preferred craft, and time to meditate both on the world and on things known only to myself. So what if I suddenly had a living, breathing baby to look after? Would I raise him into a stable and content adult with the maternal instincts I didn't know I had? Or would my inexperience and neglect turn him into a monster? Like, or unlike, Michael Gruber's The Witch's Boy, first published in 2005 and recommended for readers 12 and up. Deep in the woods, far from the ways of man, a witch lives in peaceful solitude. Neither good nor evil, her very name unknown but to herself and to the powers she serves, she spends her days studying nature and its many mysteries, the flora and fauna her only company. But one day she comes across something strange, even to her. An abandoned infant, more goblin than human, possibly the most hideous offspring ever spawned. Against her better judgment, the witch takes him in, intending to raise him with the help of her cat familiar, Falance, Izul the she-bear, and Baggerdax, a powerful demon. Though the boy, whom the witch names Lump, at first thrives within this home filled with magic and wonder, such a childhood leaves him woefully unprepared when he is faced with the cold reality that is mankind and its cruelty. As Lump grows up, his broken heart and unfulfilled dreams corrupt him with a lust for power that threatens his foster mother and those loyal to her. With neither the witch's teachings nor all the magic in the world able to reform or heal him, it falls on Lump himself to rediscover the innocence he once had and seek out his own inner peace and happiness. As of the time of this writing, I've not read any of Michael Gruber's other books, so I can't offer any comparisons between this and them. All I can say is, when I found The Witch's Boy as a young teen, I thought, hey, it has magic in it. I'm in. Readers who love fairy tales, like me, will love the way Gruber weaves in references to many famous fairy tales, having both protagonists and side characters of the narrative proper talk about them as though they were personal experiences or actual historical events. But these serve a greater purpose than simply further showing off the already magical setting. Gruber subverts these tales in ways that realistically explore characters' psyches and motivations, and which not so subtly suggest that the traditional stories are just the offensively sanitized, nonsensical ramblings of superstitious humans, and these new accounts tell the real, brutally honest truth as nature intended. Depending on your point of view, it can be difficult to decide which versions are meant to be more provocative and disturbing. That being said, we are offered some very intriguing alternate scenarios here. For example, what if Cinderella was in fact an unhinged clean freak who ditched her kind, not mean stepmother for the prince? What if Pinocchio did forego school to become a performer? What if Sleeping Beauty regretted being awakened and longed to go back to her perfect dream world? And what if a dangerous predator was instead a true friend and ally and a brave strong man the real monster to the witch when she was once an innocent little girl in a bright red cloak? But fantasy is only the backdrop to a story that can be all too real. A mother who, besides being distracted by her work, doesn't know how to be a mother in the first place, and the negative impact this has on her charge. The witch is not the easiest protagonist to sympathize with at times. As far as parenting is concerned, she is often lazy and selfish, making excuses for her faults while being confused whenever Lump is disagreeable. But these are portrayed not as evil traits so much as human ones. It is interesting to note that the omniscient narrator refers to the witch primarily as the woman. This is partly due to her true name being a cosmic mystery not meant for mortal ears, but I think it also emphasizes the fact that she may be practically a deity in her own right, but she is also still a woman. She can easily make sure Lump has food and shelter, but as she comes to see too late the result of giving him little else, all she is left with is an angry and bitter child, and she, for all her power, is left feeling truly vulnerable and full of guilt and regret. Pages 62 through 65. "That child is spoiled," said the cat from his comfortable perch on a stone niche near the hearth. The woman looked at him crossly and was about to make an objection, but a tiredness came over her suddenly, of the sort well known to those whose children have not turned out as well as they had expected, and she simply sighed. "I think you are right, Valance," she admitted. "I cannot see why, however. That boy has had everything that is proper for a child. Food, warmth, shelter, well-fitting shoes. What we say," the cat said, interrupting this litany, "is cuff and cuddle cat's the kitten. This child has had little of either cuffs or cuddles." "That is untrue," said the woman. "I have spent many hours with him, baby and boy." "Yes, and when he grew fretful, or you bored, you called for Azul." "What? Am I to be taught mothering by an old tomcat?" For once, the cat did not flinch. Cats have a keen sense of who has the moral advantage, and having once seized it, he was not about to give it up. He ignored her angry gaze. "In fact," he continued, "you are not fond of him, or rather you are as fond of him as you are of everything. His little achievements bring a smile to your lips, but it is the same smile you bestow on the first iris or a passing badger. You are correct that I am no expert, yet I don't think this is the usual case among mothers of men. Instead, they dote. With us, it sometimes happens that a mother will ignore one of her kits, and it will grow into a runt, snarling and ill-mannered, yet still it has its brothers and sisters to heap among, be warmed by, to play with and learn from. You will observe that Lump has never had this chance. He has no sibs, nor even friends of his own kind." "I never had friends!" the woman blurted out in a strange, harsh tone that surprised both her companion and her. Then they were both silent for a period, while she tended to her pastry. She made a tray of strawberry tarts, Lump's favorite, stoked the fire, and popped them into the oven. Wiping her hands, she settled herself in a chair facing the hearth. When she spoke, her voice was weary. "I suppose you will say I should have known better. You will say you warned me of this." "No cat would be so rude," said Valance. "You followed your heart, which, despite all, cannot be entirely ill. Nevertheless, it is a fair puzzle. Something must be done. The child is what, 10 years old?" "Something like that," said the woman, suddenly conscious that parents elsewhere were not so vague and made much of their children's birthdays and held parties to celebrate them. The woman had never thought to do this and regretted it now. Witches do not attend many parties, and those they do go to are hardly suitable for children. "Then it is time you thought about what he will do to make his way in the world," the cat went on. "He cannot stay here forever." "No, of course not," the woman murmured. Of course, Lump is not blameless either. The segments in which he watches his enchanted windows reminds me of the final lines from the second-to-last chapter of Peter Pan, in which Peter watches the darling children's reunion with their parents from afar. Quote, "There could not have been a lovelier sight, but there was none to see it except a strange boy who was staring in at the window. He had ecstasies innumerable that other children can never know, but he was looking through the window at the one joy from which he must be forever barred." I think this matches Lump's dilemma perfectly. He too is surrounded by marvels that any kid would be lucky enough to even dream about, but no friends to share them with. However, Peter Pan is literally a master of his realm, able to fly and to fight, with no authority figures to thwart him. Lump has no magical abilities whatsoever and is subject to the wishes of both his mother and her servants. But perhaps most pitiful of all, he lacks even the freedom to seek out friends. He is not allowed any contact with other people due to his appearance, partly for his protection. But then he has no idea that he is ugly. Not only does this delude him into believing he is handsome while humans are deformed, but it gives him an increasingly dangerous superiority complex. The continual denial of his desires and reminding of his weaknesses only further intensify his loneliness and eventually his egotism. Pages 71 to 74. A year passed. Lump was nearly 11, the age when to ordinary children the company of friends is the dearest thing in the world. But Lump had no friends. Now such children will often invent companions. In Lump's case, this natural tendency was supported by his 2 magic windows. Lump could hear the shuffling and pawing of the camels in the stockade and an occasional raucous bleat. A tall, narrow door opened at the side of the inn, and a small figure emerged, a boy of about Lump's own age, dressed in a white robe and a white skull cap. Lump watched as the boy fed and watered the camels. Lump seemed to be right behind him as he worked and murmured to the beasts. "I don't speak your language," Lump said in a low, urgent voice, "but I know so much about you. I know your name is Jer, and you have 2 sisters, Molly and Zira, and your mother is Layla. Your father is dead, killed by bandits, you believe, and you help your mother run the caravanserai. It is a lonely place, and while many people pass through, no one stays for long, and the friendships you make are only passing ones. You are lonely, I know. Sometimes at night you come out by yourself and sing to the camels, playing music on a harp with 2 strings. How I wish you would look up just once and see me. Please look up. I am so lonely too." And then it seemed that Jer did look up, and that their eyes met, and that Jer smiled at him. But it was only that a hawk had flown across the dunes, as it were, behind Lump, where he could never look. Then the bird flew over the caravanserai and away, and Jer lifted his empty bucket and went back inside. Lump could have wept with vexation. "Farewell, my friends," he whispered through the glass. His breath clouded over the dancing scene like fog from the sea. Here was the real reason that he had wanted to learn magic, to command dragons and flying carpets, as he had seen and heard in the stories Baggerdax had caused to play on his walls. Yes, he was a prisoner too, a handsome prince cast away from all he loved. And these feelings only get worse as Lump grows into adulthood. By this time, he is much wiser regarding human nature, and as such, much more painfully aware and self-conscious of his looks. But this isn't the only thing that hinders his social skills. Magic has enabled him to see the best and most beautiful the world has to offer. As a result, his views have been warped and his taste spoiled for its plainer, less awe-inspiring side. So when a genuine opportunity to make friends with honest, caring people does come his way, he can't bring himself to take those hands for fear of either being rejected or appearing common and weak, as has been done to him so often before. Like many coming-of-age and self-discovery stories, this book isn't easy to talk about without giving too much away. What makes The Witch's Boy so masterful isn't only its stunning, mystical, and romantic imagery and characters we want to see succeed in spite of their flaws and mistakes. It has a captivating way of using fantasy as a lens with which younger readers can explore issues faced by children and adults every day. From parenthood and familial relationships to social interaction, childhood trauma, and healing through personal reflection and forgiveness. Just as one doesn't have to be young, beautiful, or even human in order to embark on a hero's journey, one doesn't have to be magic in order to make their own in their walk of life. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. After receiving a PlayStation 2 for my 16th birthday in 2002, it would be almost another decade before I'd add another game console to my collection. When Limbo arrived in 2010 for the Xbox 360, I was dying to play, but I was afraid I'd never get the chance. It wasn't a lack of money and time that stopped me. No. It was the fact that the game was to be released as a download rather than a physical disc. And so, fears of viruses and privacy breaches kept me away from a fascinatingly dark gaming experience for a long time. In the end, it was a Microsoft triple pack featuring Limbo that put my mind at ease. But then, this epic beauty came along. And of course, a disc version wouldn't be available in the States. But with a bit of research and some kind help from a GameStop employee, I was finally able to conquer my fear and successfully download the game. Although, I still do prefer game codes over credit cards for purchasing. Hey, can't be too careful, right? Let us journey through Outland, released April 27th, 2011, and rated E10 for some fantasy violence. An ordinary man from a tribe deep within a flourishing jungle finds himself plagued by devastating visions of the past. Medicine does him no good, so at last, in desperation, he seeks the aid of the Pal Kaba, a wise shaman. The shaman tells him of the Sisters of Chaos, twin goddesses, one the essence of the sun's light, the other the force of the moon's darkness, who sought to destroy the world they themselves helped to create. 30,000 years ago, a powerful warrior faced the sisters in battle. He ultimately perished, but not before imprisoning them in order to protect the world from their madness. According to the shaman, the man is the reincarnation of that ancient hero. The visions are a warning from the warrior's spirit. The sisters have broken free and are bent on carrying out their apocalyptic destruction once again. Endowed with the same powers of light and darkness wielded by both his ancestor and Chaos themselves, the man must make his way to the Temple of Eternity and stop the sisters before their insanity wipes out all life from existence. With the exception of Shadow of the Colossus, I think this is the most visually stunning game of the action-adventure genre that I've ever played. But unlike Shadow, with its comparatively washed-out hues, Outland derives much of its splendor from its vibrant color palette. The art design reminds me of the Tron films, except the industrial techno city is now a lush, untamed terrain in which ancient ruins reminiscent of Aztec art hide within gnarled trees and twisted vines. Both the landmarks and the characters are black silhouettes against a backdrop awash in color, though the latter's features are more defined by the bright colors lining their otherwise shadowed forms, like elaborate full-body LED tattoos. Outland has often been compared to the 2001 2D shooter, Ikaruga, in which the player must switch between two color polarities in order to fight ships and giant mechas of the opposite color and stay immune to attacks of the same color. Likewise, besides weapons and abilities one might expect to see in a traditional hack-and-slash game, a sword to slice enemies, sliding and stomping to stun and break barriers, etc., the player in Outland must utilize the powers of light and darkness, represented by blue and red respectively, also to fight enemies and resist attacks according to their own color. Not only is blue and red an attractive combination to the eye, but enemy projectiles are often displayed in flowing, elegantly symmetrical patterns, making for spectacles as dazzling to players as they are dangerous. However, the polarity mechanic featured here may be identical to that of Ikaruga, but I think Outland's use of it is a lot more thematically significant. Every facet, from the levels to the environments to the bosses, is designed so that it's impossible to complete the game without the use of both powers. In a superb example of the video game concept, mechanics as metaphor, it dispenses with the tired goodness of light conquering the evil darkness cliché, and instead illustrates and focuses on natural balance. Just as no one color or polarity is any stronger or better than the other in the game, nature itself is also neutral, as capable of ugliness, pain, and death as it is of beauty, healing, and life. Within the 4 environments the player must traverse, the jungle, the underground, the city, and the sky, a variety of deadly creatures lie in wait. Giant spiders, man-eating serpents, mummified soldiers, flying electric jellyfish, exploding armadillos, for whatever reason, and of course, the wrathful protectors of the world that have succumbed to corruption. After a protector has been defeated, we hear the tragic backstory of its fall from grace, each one mentally scarred by the sisters' defeat and imprisonment, leaving them destructive shadows of their former glorious selves. All this and more we learn through the narration of the shaman himself. The only voice acting role in the entire game, the shaman is played by Andrew Chaikin, also known as famed throat singer and beatboxer Kid Beyond. Here, his voice is low and worn, with a deep, husky tone, giving it an aged quality that perfectly conjures the image of a wise old man, handing down the ancient stories and teachings to future generations so that they will not be lost. And a game this epic wouldn't be complete without music to match. The soundtrack of Outland was made by Finnish game composer and musician Ari Pulkkinen. Listening to the main theme at the title screen is like opening a book or taking a seat before a storyteller. Underneath the soft, smooth notes and tranquil tempo lies the promise of new beginnings, for the first time, or yet again. The cursed forest evokes a lingering sense of danger, invisible but ominous, much like the beasts before they attack at the first sign of weakness. Return to Holy Mountain, as its name implies, has a calm, sacred air about it, as if to speak over it would be sacrilege. And during the boss battles we hear a rousing piece that sings of destiny and the ever-fierce will to live, even in the face of impossible odds and impending doom. Hence the title, The End of All Things. This couldn't be more different in tone from Pulkkinen's most famous contribution to video game music, the original theme song to Angry Birds. Honestly, I don't think I've been so surprised and impressed by an artist's creative diversity since I found out that the author of God Bless the Gargoyles, a gentle and moving picture book featuring lonely stone gargoyles being comforted by kind angels, is the very same mastermind behind the gross and wacky Captain Underpants. But I digress. Taking inspiration in part from the original Fallout games and the films The Passion of the Christ and Apocalypto, Pulkkinen weaves together the sounds of ethnic instruments and strong percussion to create ambient styles as wide-ranging and powerful as the warring emotions within the heart that struggles to survive in such a remote and savage world. With its smooth and responsive controls, awesome abilities, and plenty of enemy variety in action, Outland is an immensely satisfying bullet hell platformer to play. But just as important, if not more, its gorgeous visuals, enthralling narrative, and imaginative mechanics altogether help to create a true interactive gem in more ways than one. Like the best games and stories out there, this is an experience that plays exactly how and what it advocates: timelessness and balance. Gather round next time for a tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. Warning, this story contains graphic depictions of blood, gore, and violent illness. Listener and researcher discretion is advised. In the spring of 2017, my sister and I attended MantaCon, the official convention of military sci-fi author David Weber. I wasn't as interested in him as she was, but it was still a great chance for us to spend time together, and there were plenty of other writers for me to chat with and books and memorabilia for me to geek out over. When I asked her later how she liked meeting one of her literary heroes, she told me that he was actually a really nice guy and a joy to talk to. I felt some relief at this because, to be honest, I had been a bit worried. I couldn't help thinking that this whole trip could have been ruined for her had Weber treated her or his other fans poorly. It really is incredible how easy it is to forget that the celebrities we idolize are just as human as anyone else. So just what on earth is it that makes a person want to pay $31,000 for John Lennon's tooth, or $28,000 for a grilled cheese supposedly bearing the image of the Virgin Mary? I wish I was making that up. Sad enough this happens in real life, but if the technology represented in this film actually existed, heaven please forbid, would it really be that surprising if somebody out there wanted to take advantage of it, depraved though it is? Here is Antiviral, premiering in May of 2012 and strongly recommended for mature viewers only. In an alternate near-future America, celebrity mania has reached unprecedented heights as advancing technology has allowed the public to indulge ever more in the lives of their idols. Now a new industry that profits off this obsession has established itself in the mainstream. Whenever a celebrity falls ill, trained individuals from specialized corporations, like the Lucas Clinic, harvest their infected DNA and then inject it into the bodies of paying customers so that they may suffer as their icons do. Enter Sid March, one of the Lucas Clinic's finest employees. When not pitching the hottest and latest viruses to eager clients, he's busy making extra cash on the side by smuggling samples within his own body and selling them on the black market. And so, when Hannah Geist, the most popular and lucrative host in Lucas's collection, contracts a never-before-seen disease, Sid loses no time in infecting himself with her tainted blood. To his surprise and alarm, this one proves deadly, absolutely ravaging his body with its excruciating and horrifying symptoms. But Sid's true suffering is only just beginning when he learns that Miss Geist has apparently died from the illness, making him the next best thing available to the masses ravenous for her now priceless samples. Now the target of business rivals and piracy groups alike, Sid must solve the mystery behind the virus and cure himself before he is consumed by either it or the ruthless entrepreneurs on his tail. The film's director, Brandon Cronenberg, may not be familiar to mainstream audiences, but his father very much is. One of the pioneers of body horror cinema, David Cronenberg's best-known films, though highly controversial due to their excessive gore and violence, explore numerous mature and visceral topics through the science fiction and horror genres. For example, the fear of the human and/or female body in The Brood, the devastating mental and social impacts of media consumption in Videodrome, and the terrifying inevitabilities of disease, terminal illness, and old age in his 1986 remake of The Fly, just to name a few. His son's directorial debut similarly makes biting commentary on a less than savory aspect of modern American culture, an issue that's become more relevant than ever in the 21st century as internet and social media have exploded in scope and popularity. Brandon's inspiration for Antiviral came in two parts. The first occurred during an intense fever dream brought on by a viral infection. In a state of delirium, he obsessed over the idea that what was now inside his own body came from inside another person's body, and thought of the strange intimacy of such a connection. Afterwards, he realized that celebrity-obsessed fans actually epitomized this idea in the way they fetishized the body. He was further inspired by an episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live, in which actress Sarah Michelle Gellar, who was ill at the time, remarked during her interview that she'd infect the entire audience if she sneezed, resulting in said audience bursting into applause. Just think about that for a moment. Brandon incorporates this distorted point of view into numerous aspects of the film. Take the visuals. The coloring is pale and washed out, adding to the lifeless tone. Moreover, the clinics are a spotless, almost painfully blinding white, mixing the unnatural sanitation of a hospital with the cold chicness of a fashion industry office building. The only color that really stands out at all is red. Shades that aren't bright and vivid, like for the blood, are often brownish and muddy, emphasizing the ugly reality of filth underneath the clean facade of fame. Another important symbol is the flower, particularly the tulip, the logo of the Lucas Clinic. There is a real-life phenomenon in which tulips, normally solid-colored when healthy, are affected by a virus and broken, resulting in a streaked, multicolored appearance. Far from being rejected as a biological mutation, their attractiveness has since prompted flower enthusiasts to intentionally breed them to this day, though they are much more fragile. This is not unlike the film's consumers breaking themselves with human pathogens for the sake of superficial beauty, no matter how fragile they become. In this universe, bodily fetishism is not only advertised as a pleasurable pastime, it's justified as a state of transcendence to the point of being its own religion. Much like how we are taught to take the universal teachings of Bible stories or fairy tales to heart in order to lead fruitful lives, so too do these otherwise rational, law-abiding people glean their own meaning according to the will and appearances of their favorite superstars. That being said, we never learn how or why these celebrities are famous in the first place. This blatant lack of depth brilliantly mirrors our sad reality that many people don't care about a celebrity's actual talents and achievements, assuming they have any, regardless of their genius or their stupidity, so long as the stars keep shining on camera. Such is the case of our anti-hero. If the public are the disciples of this church of glamour, then Sid is its high priest. Like any good businessman, Sid is smart, cool, and confident, taking his work very seriously while clearly enjoying every minute of it. But he puts a whole new spin on the concept of working oneself to death. His apartment, though not as fancy as the clinic, is just as disturbingly white. He often has a thermometer in his mouth, and his refrigerator has literally nothing in it except prepackaged egg salad sandwiches and bottle upon bottle of orange juice. All traditional means of healing that seem strangely feeble and laughable, considering he constantly exposes himself to multiple diseases much more serious than the common cold. But even before he's reduced to using a cane just to walk, he is an old man, frail-looking, with pasty skin and dull eyes, an appearance and role very well executed by actor Caleb Landry Jones, who was only 22 at the time. Sid seems all the more zombified and oppressed whenever he is all but swallowed up by the enlarged, looming photos of Hannah Geist that take over every shot they share, like a fly before a god. Nevertheless, he has no regret whatsoever in devoting his very being to her. His voice, already soft and raspy, becomes even more so when he delivers his sales pitches, an edge to his speech that borders on lust. I once read a very intriguing YouTube comment for the film's trailer that said Hannah Geist's full name roughly translates to Holy Spirit. Further research told me that the name Hannah means favor or grace in Hebrew, and Geist in German can be translated into such words as ghost, mind, or spirit, depending on context. The only more appropriate surname would be Zeitgeist, but that would be way too obvious. Interestingly, the context in which Edmund Spenser uses the word Geist in his 1590 epic poem, The Fairy Queen, is suggestive not so much of a ghost or apparition, as the latent mind of one still alive. Compared to the works of his father, especially those of the 1980s, Brandon Cronenberg's Antiviral isn't as over-the-top in its gore or as trippy in its visuals and effects, but I think this works in its favor, because nor is it as far-fetched in its plausibility. Its use of believable science and violence that's somehow both extreme and subtle at the same time, to offer intelligent insight on people's already very real and unhealthy infatuation with the rich and famous, makes this film all the more ominous. And there are times, in fiction and otherwise, when the only way to make a point and make it stick really is to get right in people's faces. Or maybe even deeper than that. Gather round next time for a tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. It's not entirely surprising when kids and adults say they want to trade places. Kids usually want the respect and power that only comes with age, and adults often wish they could go back to the days of boundless energy and carefree dreams. As for me, while I would never get rid of my inner child for anything, I really have no regrets leaving my childhood in the past where it belongs. There are plenty of tales out there that explore these ideas, sometimes by way of showing children literally becoming stuck in adults' bodies and or adults in children's bodies, whether through body switching or accelerated aging or de-aging, with the immediate results often being equal parts weird and hilarious. But when all is said and done, such scenarios typically end with said characters being returned to their proper ages and forms, wiser for the wearer. But what if that end didn't come for years, or even decades? What if it never came at all? Would the result be depression, confusion, anger, madness, or maybe all of the above, such as what is felt by Keith Donahue's The Stolen Child, first published in 2006 and recommended for readers 17 and up. In 1949, 7-year-old Henry Day is kidnapped by changelings, wild, ancient, childlike creatures that dwell in the woods, and becomes one of them. Meanwhile, another changeling takes his place, reforming himself in Henry's image and now living his life among the Day family. In time, they each learn to adjust to their new roles. The new changeling, renamed Anna Day by his now fellow changelings, must adapt to and survive their strange ways as well as the harsh wilderness, while the new Henry Day must cope with the ordinary but strenuous trials of adolescence. But even as the two boys overcome their respective ordeals and thrive in the years that follow, they are increasingly haunted by vague memories of their past and regretful of the humanity they lost at the hands of the changelings. Despite the risk of discovery and death by humans becoming ever greater as a result of their growing obsession, neither Henry nor Anna Day will be able to rest until they understand who they once were and find a way to come to terms with each other and all of their identities. Donahue's debut novel is inspired by the 1889 poem of the same name by famed Irish poet William Butler Yeats about fairies beguiling and tempting a human child to run away with them. In relation to this book, I think the romantic implications of Yeats's poem are painfully ironic. Donahue keeps the primary lore about the human-fairy switch intact, but that's where the similarities end. His changeling band is indigenous hunter-gatherer tribe, wolf pack, and kid street gang all rolled into one. They survive off the land while also organizing raids in order to steal clothes and supplies for protection against the elements as well as for amusement. It's almost like observing an ongoing slumber party at a permanent summer camp, albeit with kids under 10 smoking and even lovemaking at times. Henry and Anna Day tell their stories years after their respective switches occurred. Thus, their adult voices and minds are consistent even when they are children. In spite of the radically different lives they once lived and are living now, they still cherish their humanity more than anything, and often show their disgust at the changelings' conduct. The boys fear losing not only their personal memories, but the very memory of being human. Thus, they each turn to a hobby that epitomizes what separates humans from animals, the arts. Anna Day takes to reading, writing, and drawing, I think in part because, having lived only 7 human years before being taken, it's really all he knows at that point, and to his dismay, it shows. Between the limitations of his used and stolen art supplies and his initial pitiful lack of artistic ability, his desperation to keep alive what he believes to be his true self is palpable. Pages 51 to 53. Up and out of bed, I savored the light growing strong enough for drawing and writing. I took out my papers and pencil, put a cold flat stone on my lap, and folded the mortgage statement into quarters. I drew a cross along the folds and made panels for 4 drawings. The pencil was at once odd and familiar in my grasp. In the first panel, I created from memory my mother and father, my 2 baby sisters, and myself, full-body portraits lined up in a straight row. When I considered my work, they looked crude and uneven, and I was disappointed in myself. Writing proved more painful than drawing. Certain letters, B, G, R, W, caused my hand to cramp. In those early writings, sometimes my K bent backwards, S went astray, an F accidentally became an E, and other errors that are amusing to me now as I look back on my early years. But at the time, my handwriting caused me much shame and embarrassment. Worse than the alphabet, however, were the words themselves. I could not spell for beans and lacked all punctuation. My vocabulary annoyed me, not to mention style, diction, sentence structure, variety, adjectives and adverbs, and other such matters. The physical act of writing took forever. Sentences had to be assembled nail by nail, and once complete, they stood no better than a crude approximation of what I felt or wanted to say, a woebegone fence across a white field. Yet I persisted through that morning, writing down all I could remember in whatever words I had at my command. For his part, Henry couldn't be happier being a normal human once more, or more terrified that it could end all over again. He finds his artistic calling in music. After the initial difficulty of mastering the piano at a rate not unusual for a young boy, his imagination is enriched and his soul stirred in a way they could never be when he lived among the callous and unrefined changelings. Page 44. For the next 8 years, I took piano lessons, and it was the happiest time of all my lives. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, the trip to the city proved a tonic, away from farm and family and into civilization. No longer something wild, but a creature of culture, on my way to becoming a virtuoso once again. Skipping to pages 55 to 57. The glory of the experience rested in the simple fact that my musical talent was a human one. There were no pianos in the woods, and as my magic slowly diminished, my artistry increased. I felt more and more removed from those who had taken me for 100 years, and my sole hope and prayer was that they would leave me alone. I played every chance I could get. Over the next few years, I spent hours each day at the keys, enthralled by the mathematics of the notes. The music seized me like a river current, pushing my conscious self deeper into my core, as if there were no other sound in the world but one. I grew my legs an inch longer than necessary that first summer in order to better reach the pedals on the upright. Around the house, school, and town, I practiced spreading my fingers as far apart as they would go. The pads of my fingertips became smooth and feather-sensitive. My shoulders bowed down and forward. I dreamt in wave after wave of scales. The more adept my skill and understanding grew, the more I realized the power of musical phrasing in everyday life. The trick involves getting people to listen to the weak beats and seemingly insignificant silences between notes, the absence of tones between tones. By phrasing the matter with a ruthlessly precise logic, one can play or say anything. Music taught me great self-control. As the book progresses, we see how the boys' actions directly and indirectly influence more than just each other. No matter how carefully Henry and Anaday tried to distance themselves from each other's races in order to protect themselves, their close proximity torments and endangers them both. But just as bad as their mortal danger, if not worse, is the psychological danger placed on those around them, namely when those victims wind up witnessing more than, and yet not as much as they should. Henry's point of view, pages 98 to 99. Dad's voice woke me at first light, and I followed the sound from my bedroom and through the back doorway. A feathery mist rose from the lawn, and he stood, his back to me, in the middle of the wet grass, calling out my name as he faced a stand of firs. A dark trail of footsteps led into the woods 10 feet in front of him. He was stuck to the spot, as if he had startled a wild animal that fled away in fear. But I saw no creature. By the time I drew near, the diminuendo of a few raspy calls of Henry lingered in the air. Then he fell to his knees, bent his head to the ground, and quietly wept. I crept back into the house and pretended to be reading the sports page when he came in. My father stared at me hunched over the newspaper, my long fingers wrapped around a coffee cup. The wet belt of his robe dragged along the floor like a chain. Soaked, disheveled, and unshaven, he seemed much older, but maybe I had not noticed before how he was aging. His hands trembled as if pulsed, and he took a Camel from his pocket. The cigarette was too wet to light despite his repeated attempts, so he crumpled the whole pack and tossed it into the trash can. I set a cup of coffee in front of him, and he stared at the steam as if I had handed him poison. "Dad, are you all right? You look a mess." "You." He pointed his finger at me like a gun, but that's all he said. The word hung in the air all morning, and I do not think I ever heard him call me Henry again. Anaday's point of view, pages 108 to 109. The door swung open suddenly, petrifying me on the spot. A man came down the stairs, pausing on the next-to-bottom step to light a cigarette. Wrapped in a blue robe, the figure took one step forward, then lifted his foot, startled by the moisture. He laughed and cursed softly. The specter still did not notice me, though we faced each other, he at the edge of the house, and I at the edge of the forest. I wanted to turn around and see what he was looking for, but I stood frozen as a hair as the daybreak lifted around us. From the lawn, a chill rose in wisps of fog. He drew closer, and I held my breath. Not a dozen steps between us, he stopped. The cigarette fell from his fingers. He took one more step toward me. His brow creased with worry. His thin hair blew in the breeze. An eternity passed as his eyes danced in their sockets. His lips trembled when he opened his mouth to speak. "And we? The words coming to me did not make sense. "Is it true? Achoo? Can it be? Houston?" The sounds he made hurt my ears. At that moment I wished to be sleeping in Speck's arms again. He knelt on the damp grass and spread out his arms as if he expected me to run to him. But I was confused and did not know if he meant me harm, so I turned and sprinted as fast as I could go. The monstrous gargle from his throat followed me deep into the forest until, as suddenly, the strange words stopped, yet I kept running all the way home. What makes this all the more tragic is that, because the boys are only telling what they know from only their own perspectives, they never see or understand the full truth of either the sequence of events or each other's true feelings the way the readers do. The more their lives intersect, the more the simple misunderstandings pile up. Like the lead-up to a war, the animosity between two well-meaning but very confused individuals from vastly different cultures intensifies until it comes to a head. What's worse, their very natures forbid them from asking for help or baring their souls to virtually anyone, and inner battles are often much harder to fight than outside ones. Though not a revenge story at its core, it does illustrate a real struggle between two sides with much at stake. An emotional and bittersweet tale of an identity crisis at its most hellish, The Stolen Child offers a highly unique take on the changeling legend that portrays the loss of innocence, the defining and preservation of humanity, and the relentless search for one's true self. Out of all the changeling-related plots I've seen in other media, this novel is to me one of the most psychologically complex and existentially ambiguous, making a serious attempt to realistically address the implications of such a drastic change to one's very being. For when has a soul not felt lost and alone upon being ripped from all they know, never to see it again, except in memory? Gather round next time for a tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. I'm sorry to say that I lost my dad's VHS copy of this movie as a kid. He has told me that he couldn't care less about it now, and of course I believe him. Still, I do feel a sliver of guilt about it every now and again. So, yeah. Sorry, Dad. In another example of 5-year-old mistaking on my part, by the time I saw this movie, I had already been on a long and steady diet of Disney fare, resulting in the misguided belief that anything animated was exclusively for kids and therefore fun, while anything not animated was exclusively for grown-ups and therefore not fun. While certainly not family unfriendly by any stretch, this was one of the first films I saw that began to subtly chip away at that belief, for which I am now eternally grateful. And, as an added bonus, I don't think I could have had a better introduction than this to the immortal musical movement that was the Beatles. Let's all take a ride on Yellow Submarine. First released July 17th, 1968, and rated G, ages 7 and up. "80,000 leagues beneath the sea lays, or lies, the narrator's not too sure, the beautiful utopia known as Pepperland. In this paradise of light and color, and under the protection of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the gentle, peace-loving inhabitants spend their days creating music with which to entertain and bring joy to one another. But the hairy, long-nosed blue meanies decide they are fed up with such cheerful sounds and attack with all their music-hating might, reducing Pepperland to a gray and silent wasteland. At the behest of the elderly Lord Mayor, the only slightly less elderly sailor, Old Fred, takes the titular Yellow Submarine and travels up to the surface to seek help. He ultimately finds himself in 1960s England, where he comes across a bored and depressed Ringo Starr wandering the streets of Liverpool. Touched by Old Fred's story, Ringo takes him to meet his bandmates, the charismatic John Lennon, the spiritual George Harrison, and the nonchalant Paul McCartney. And so the Fab Four agree to accompany Old Fred in the magical sub through bizarre and dangerous waters. Armed with nothing but the powers of music, peace, and love, the Beatles must face off against the spitefully insane Chief Blue Meanie and his oddball minions in order to save Pepperland and restore its people to their former happy and harmonious selves. The film is based on the song of the same name, written by McCartney and Lennon, and first released on the Beatles' 1966 album, Revolver. It was originally intended as a nonsense song for children, but over time has been increasingly believed by adults to carry social and political symbolism. I personally see it as a song best enjoyed with a bunch of friends of any age who couldn't care less how long it goes on or whether they or anyone else can carry a tune to begin with. And no, you don't have to be either drunk or high to get the full, delightfully silly effect. And speaking of trippy states of mind, this is the movie that set the standard for me when it comes to animation that's a combination of explosively colorful and weird to the point where you start to wonder if the creators weren't on something themselves. Anime like Mononoke and Catnapped, and obscure pre-90s movies like Fantastic Planet and Twice Upon a Time spring to mind. Though primarily 2D animated, Yellow Submarine cranks the eye candy level up to 11 by utilizing a variety of animations and art styles. Among others, there's rotoscoping, Andy Warhol-esque pop art, and cutout imagery reminiscent of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Moreover, though made when the Beatles were at the height of their popularity, Yellow Submarine still looks and feels like a high-quality animated musical with real artistic effort put into it, rather than just an hour and a half worth of Beatles songs strung together by a series of random acting scenes. Magical Mystery Tour, I'm looking at you. Not only are the song segments fun music videos in their own right, but the classic Beatles tunes peppering the film, pun intended, blend seamlessly with the narrative and help to move it along. Eleanor Rigby is played as the Yellow Submarine flies over Liverpool, with all the lonely people going through the motions of their seemingly unfulfilling day-to-day lives. In the much more upbeat All Together Now, our heroes have just entered the sub and are now learning, or rather playing with, the controls, and having a grand old time doing it. And the crew perform When I'm 64 while traveling through the sea of time, after first shrinking down into children, and then literally being buried in piles of their own whitening hair as they age into old men. There are also strong elements of Alice in Wonderland, but not just for the obvious reasons like the weird landscapes and the crazy creatures. The protagonists act not like they're on a rescue mission, but rather a self-guided tour. They encounter some curiosity, have an experience with it, and then move on to the next one. As a matter of fact, the Beatles don't react half as strongly to their adventures as Alice does to hers, and what they see is way freakier than anything Carol ever came up with. But this actually makes them even funnier to watch because of how utterly dorky they are. Whether they're stumbling from one fever dream situation to another and surviving through nothing but sheer dumb luck, or bantering in their thick British accents about some pseudo-philosophical gibberish like lazy college buddies, sometimes they just make you want to shake your head in a mixture of aggrieved pity and barely suppressed exasperation, even when their lovably goofy charm makes you want to laugh. Not to mention their puns so embarrassingly lame they make Looney Tunes humor look sophisticated. The original characters are even less complex in terms of motivation and personality, but in such a bonkers world they really couldn't be any other way, nor should they. The Chief Blue Meanie is like Gonzo the Muppet with the body of a life-size Chia Pet and the quote-unquote manners of the Queen of Hearts. Calm and collected and agreeable one moment, screaming like a psychopathic toddler at the slightest provocation the next. Old Fred is a brave and true sailorman, but also kind of a melodramatic twit. Granted, his people and homeland are in danger, but his childish pleading and one-track mind seldom encourage the rest of the cast to take him very seriously. But my favorite is one Jeremy Hillary Boob, Ph.D., with a rabbit-like body, pink monkey ears and a fluffy tail, the face of a clown, and a habit for perpetually speaking in rhyme. Jeremy has an insatiable passion for knowledge and scholarly endeavors. The epitome of the absent-minded professor, he often forgets his own facts, contradicts himself, and fixes broken objects a bit too well. But he's just so adorable in his enthusiasm as well as his appearance that you can never stay mad at him for long. Having said all that, if there is anyone here who does display any real character development, it's Ringo. He's easily the kindest and most sensitive of the quartet, even to the point of making the other three look like jerks. While John, George, and Paul tend to tease him and show a sort of just-along-for-the-ride kind of attitude throughout, Ringo actually stops and thinks about his place in the world, or lack thereof, and cares about the feelings and well-being of others, even a so-called nowhere man. In hindsight, if not for Ringo, there wouldn't even be a story, never mind the deliverance of his civilization. Of course, I might be overanalyzing a tiny detail in a movie better known for random madness than logic or drama, but I feel that Ringo in particular is the one Beatle who seems to get anything personal out of the entire adventure, and to their credit, the other three do learn to better appreciate this, and him, by the end. Being only a casual Beatles listener myself, I can't say for certain exactly how much the Beatles of Yellow Submarine resemble their real-life counterparts. Plus, there are a few jokes and references here and there that only hardcore fans and historians are going to understand. Even so, I do know from personal experience that you don't have to know anything about the Beatles to have a complete ball with this movie. With its colorful visuals, creative absurdity, and offbeat humor, the idea of Yellow Submarine is not to be challenged by a complex story, but to have a fun and groovy experience while rocking out to some of the Beatles' greatest hits. It may very well be a product of its time, but its joyful aesthetic, just like its message, "All you need is love," will remain ever universal. Gather around next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. If there's one type of story setting with potential and possibilities that are quite literally endless, it is outer space, or more specifically, the universe. Long before humanity even conceived the scientific age, never mind entered it, we have been entranced by the sky's breathtaking splendor and fascinated by its mind-boggling phenomena. I think what I especially like about interstellar stories is what they can offer audiences in terms of symbolism and meaning. Whether you enjoy studying the ways of the purely physical and scientific, or pondering the enigmas of the deities said to live on high, there's so much here to stir the imagination of virtually any type of intellectual. But we have also been humbled and even terrified by its sheer vastness and seemingly incomprehensible mysteries. In the face of such a force of nature, there are few out there who don't question the worth and meaning of their lives on Earth, and that includes children. A profound idea explored in Kenji Miyazawa's Night on the Galactic Railroad, first published as a novel in October of 1934, and then adapted into an anime film in July of 1985, and recommended for audiences 12 and up. The life of Giovanni, a young village boy, is not an easy one. With his mother ill and his seafaring father's whereabouts unknown, he has had to work hard to support his family, leaving him no time to play with the other children and causing him to be taunted and bullied by them. But one night, as he is resting with fatigue and loneliness up on the hillside, he is stunned when a huge steam locomotive appears before him right out of the sky. He boards the train and is inexplicably joined by Campanella, the one classmate who cares for him. Giovanni is delighted in spite of his confusion, and the two boys happily ride the train together, taking in all the sights and wonders the galaxy has to offer. But it soon becomes apparent that neither this flying train nor its peculiar passengers are what they seem. And as the train approaches its final destination, Giovanni learns a valuable lesson about life, death, and true happiness. Also known in the West by titles like Night of the Milky Way Railway, Night Train to the Stars, or Fantasy Railroad in the Stars, this is Miyazawa's best-known work and to this day one of the most studied children's novels in Japan. So impressed were readers, in fact, that the novel was published not only posthumously, but technically unfinished. Though Miyazawa's untimely death in 1933 prevented him from completing the story, there was fortunately enough material written for publishers to release the book in a coherent state. But for all its success, its conception came in the wake of a great tragedy. In 1922, when he was 26 years old, Kenji lost his beloved younger sister, Toshiko, to tuberculosis. Grief-stricken, he traveled by train to Sakhalin not long after, plagued by the question of where his sister had gone after death. Not without reluctance and a heavy heart, he would eventually accept her passing and be inspired by his trip to write his story, thanks in no small part to his strong Buddhist beliefs. But as devout as Miyazawa was, his writing feels a lot more spiritual than religious, mainly because of the universality he strives to emphasize throughout. For instance, the scenes exemplifying his passion for natural sciences like astronomy and geology, from the teacher's explanation of the Milky Way to the ancient rocks and fossils found on the Pliocene coast, not only provide a nice educational touch, but blend beautifully with the plot's more mystical elements to create an atmosphere of awe and respect for the natural world. Pages 36 to 37 of the Sarah M. Strong translation. All the pebbles along the riverbed were translucent. There were clearly pieces of crystal and topaz among them. Some showed complex patterns of folds and swirls, while others, diamond bright, released a pale light like mist where two facets met. Giovanni ran to the river's edge and plunged in his hand. The uncanny water of the Milky Way's Silver River was more transparent than hydrogen, but clearly it was flowing. This could be told from the way the two boys' wrists seemed to float with a faint tinge of mercury where they were submerged in the water, and from the way the ripples that formed where the water flowed against the wrists seemed to flicker and burn with a beautiful phosphorescent light. "There's something strange here." Campanella stopped in surprise and picked up from the rock a walnut-like object, long and slender with a pointed tip. "It's a walnut. Look, there are lots of them. They didn't just wash up here. They're embedded in the rock. They're big. Twice the size of normal walnuts. This one's not the least bit broken. Come on, let's have a look over there. I bet they're digging something up." Clutching their black, jagged-edged walnuts, they headed toward the spot. On their left, the waves burned with a sort of gentle lightning as they lapped the shore, while on the right, the ears of the pampas grass, looking as though they were made of silver and seashells, rustled on the cliff. And certain artistic choices by the author also reflect a sort of social and geographical neutrality. The book offers almost no physical character descriptions, but said characters come from a village with various European features and have common Italian names, even when they are drawn as distinctly Asian. To blur the ethnic lines even further, as well as to solve the issue of visual presentation of racial and cultural identity, the animators of the film decided to depict the characters as anthropomorphic cats rather than humans. Additionally, Miyazawa had a strong interest in Esperanto, today the most widely spoken, constructed international auxiliary language in the world. The film pays homage to this by presenting each chapter title in Esperanto along with his native Japanese. More to the point, it's worth noting that the name in English means one who hopes. I don't know whether he had this implication in mind, but I think there's a connection between that and the story's biggest thematic question: what is true happiness? Here, Miyazawa suggests that the answer lies in self-sacrifice. Giovanni's own unhappiness runs deeper than just the pain of loneliness. The more he is faced with this idea, the more uncertain he becomes whether his life could ever truly benefit others. This is ironically exacerbated by his relationship with Campanella. Feeling both admiration and inferiority toward him, his only friend, Giovanni desperately wants nothing more than for the two of them to stay together forever, a desire all the more heartbreaking for the oppressive sense that it could be dashed at any time. Pages 53 to 54. For some reason, he did not know why, Giovanni began to feel unbearably sorry for the birdcatcher sitting next to him. He was about to ask the birdcatcher what he desired most, but thought that might seem too abrupt. Wondering what would be the best thing to do, he glanced behind him, only to find that the birdcatcher was no longer there. "I wonder where that man went," Campanella said softly. He too had clearly been thinking about him. "Where did he go? When will we ever see him again? Why didn't I talk to him more than I did? I was just wondering the same thing. I just considered him a nuisance. I feel awful about it." Giovanni thought he had never before felt this peculiar sort of emotion, nor said this sort of thing. Skipping to pages 75 to 76. Giovanni heaved a deep sigh. "We're back to just the two of us alone again, aren't we? Let's go on and on together forever." Bright tears welled up in Campanella's eyes. "I feel the same way," he said. "But I wonder what true happiness really is," said Giovanni. "I don't know," said Campanella in a faraway voice. "Well, we'll give it our best, won't we?" Giovanni exclaimed, drawing a deep breath as though new strength were surging up within him. "Even if I were in the middle of that huge darkness, I wouldn't be afraid," said Giovanni. "I really am going to go and search for the true happiness of everyone. Let's go on together, on and on and on forever." "I'll go for sure. How beautiful those fields are. Everyone's there. Now that's the real heaven. Look, my mother is there," Campanella shouted, pointing toward the beautiful fields he could see in the distance beyond the window. Giovanni looked, but saw nothing but hazy whiteness. It did not appear at all as Campanella described. To be sure, Giovanni's increasingly incessant questioning of whether he and his dearest friend will stay together borders on obsession, but that doesn't make him an unlikable or unsympathetic character. He is a mirror of his creator's own suffering and inner turmoil, a young man whose sudden, tragic misfortune deepened his fear and confusion as to where mortal life was headed and what, if anything, lay beyond it. And what can be more human than that? Whether you enjoy Night on the Galactic Railroad in either book or film form is going to depend greatly on taste. Its plot and tone are quiet and somber rather than epic and action-packed. and the movie in particular may require some patience, especially from children, for its sparse dialogue and relatively slow pace. But those who choose to experience it in full will be rewarded with a visually stunning and gently moving story that explores faith, grief, and self-reflection through the eyes of souls who wonder what they will leave behind, as well as what they will find next when they leave this world for good. Gather around next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms, and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector, and your host, Erica Adams. Rare is the power of an animation company that can adapt classic books into films and make those adaptations so memorable that they come to mind long before the source material does. Such is the power of Walt Disney. And even as an adult who by now has read and studied many of these books, I am most certainly no exception. I still can't read stories like Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, or The Little Mermaid without thinking of their Disney counterparts for at least a moment, no matter how different they are. Heck, it wasn't until I reached my high school and college years that I learned at all that 101 Dalmatians, Winnie the Pooh, The Great Mouse Detective, The Black Cauldron, and even the effectively disowned Song of the South weren't technically original Disney creations. I think for many of us, Disney has been the gateway through which we've been first introduced to numerous iconic books. One of the first in my own childhood was this rendition of the timeless holiday staple by Charles Dickens. Presenting Mickey's Christmas Carol, released December 16, 1983, and rated G, ages 5 and up. It's now Christmas Eve, and the inhabitants of a little village in Victorian England are abuzz with preparations and aglow with the holiday spirit. Even the severely overworked and underpaid accounting clerk, Bob Cratchit. The one exception is Ebenezer Scrooge, Cratchit's bitter and stingy boss, who views Christmas as nothing more than a nuisance at best and a money waster at worst. But Scrooge gets a rude awakening when he is visited by the ghost of his late business partner, Jacob Marley. He explains that due to being greedy and selfish while alive, he is now eternally condemned in the afterlife, and unless Scrooge changes his own ways, he will suffer the same fate. Being warned that the three ghosts of Christmas will come to him later that night, Scrooge must heed their advice or risk losing everything and being forever alone in life and in death. Now I know that most, if not all of you, are already quite familiar with this synopsis. That being said, there are some points that I can't explain without giving spoilers for this particular adaptation, so please consider yourself warned. In addition to Dickens' 1843 novella, Mickey's Christmas Carol is also based on a 1974 Disneyland record audio musical entitled An Adaptation of Dickens' Christmas Carol. It debuted in the U.S. alongside a Christmas reissue of Disney's 1977 feature film, The Rescuers, incidentally also based on a book. Go figure. It was the first Disney animated theatrical short to both feature Mickey Mouse since 1953's The Simple Things, and to garner a Best Animated Short Film nomination since 1948's Mickey and the Seal. It also marked the debut of Alan Young as the voice of Scrooge McDuck, who would be played by Young up until his death in 2016. The title itself is a misnomer, as the real star of the show is not Mickey. I'm sure you can guess who is. It goes without saying that Disney's Scrooge got more than just his name from Dickens' main character. Created by Disney comic artist Carl Barks in 1947, he was originally meant to be an antagonist for Donald Duck, just as much of a spiteful penny pincher as his namesake. But his growing popularity over the following years has caused him to be increasingly shown in a much kinder and more generous light, even to the point of his becoming a canon member of the Duck family, as seen in the DuckTales TV series of the late 1980s and its 2017 reboot. I think it could be argued that here, not only is Scrooge brought back to his miserly roots, but is therefore a quote-unquote living example of metafiction in his own right. Now obviously there have been tons of film and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol over the years, before and after this one, many of which have also featured characters from well-established franchises aimed for and beloved by younger audiences. The Flintstones, the Jetsons, Mr. Magoo, the Smurfs, Looney Tunes, Sesame Street, the Muppets, you name it. In my experience, these specials tend to present one of three scenarios. Number 1. The franchise characters put on a play of A Christmas Carol, and the episode's story proper occurs literally behind the scenes within their own respective universe. Number 2. A particular character who is already disagreeable in accordance to his franchise finds himself in a situation that mirrors the Christmas Carol plot, sees the error of his ways, and learns to show his softer side by the end, though he usually remains disagreeable overall. Or number 3. The characters reenact the story within a Dickens-style universe, but still act like their natural selves, utilizing any or all of the contemporary language, slapstick, running gags, quirky personality traits, etc. that they may be known for. Mickey's Christmas Carol does none of these things. This is a genuine, quote, real-life Victorian setting, not a stage set, and the Disney characters act and address each other according to the specific roles within Dickens' story. There are some funny moments, certainly, but no in-jokes, pop culture references, or fourth wall breaks of any kind. I find that pretty unique, especially considering these are cartoon characters that don't typically specialize in olden-day drama or tragedy. Even more impressive, though, is how tailor-made they feel for their parts. Mickey Mouse, as Bob Cratchit, retains his warmth, sincerity, and high spirits despite Scrooge's ill treatment. Donald is still Scrooge's nephew, only he goes by Fred now. He's as stubborn as he ever was, but that just makes him and his enthusiasm for the holiday all the more endearing, even when he's taking a beating. Goofy plays Jacob Marley. A decade before a Goofy movie, and he could still be serious, albeit a bit melodramatic, with his menacing ghostly wail and his dignified tone of voice. But of course, he could never get away with not showing off his typical clumsiness and hilarious trademark squeal. Even the Three Ghosts of Christmas feel authentic without their Disney character actors being a distraction. Jiminy Cricket, in a manner of speaking, reprises the conscience role he played in Pinocchio, complete with a gold medal engraved with his official title, a very nice throwback, as the ghost of Christmas past, guiding Scrooge with wisdom and reason belied by his small stature. Willie the Giant, who first appeared in the Mickey and the Beanstalk segment from the film Fun and Fancy Free, is the ghost of Christmas present, oafish and dim-witted, but also good-natured in a way that reflects his compassion and love for life's gifts. And as the ghost of Christmas future, I think this is the closest we will ever come to seeing Pete as not merely an inconsiderate jerk, but an actual evil villain, sinister and frightening. Along with the main cast, half the fun of this movie comes from the additional cameos offered. From brief unspoken appearances of others in the original Disney roster, like Chip and Dale and Huey, Dewey, and Louie, to the inclusion of far more obscure members, like Mickey's twin nephews, Morty and Ferdy Fieldmouse, the former of whom plays the short but pivotal role of Tiny Tim, to even a nod to characters from some of Disney's previous feature films, like Robin Hood and the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Whether major or minor, they each add some Christmas cheer in their own special way. For anyone looking for an entertaining but faithful and palatable adaptation with which to introduce children to Dickens' illustrious story, in my opinion, you really can't go wrong with Mickey's Christmas Carol. Of course, as is true in other family-friendly versions, a lot has been changed, glossed over, or omitted from the original source material, and Mickey, Scrooge, and the rest of the gang naturally inject this retelling with the typical humor and silliness we've come to expect from a Disney animated short. And yet they still succeed beautifully in treating the darker and more solemn moments of said source material with respect through their performances, keeping its splendor, spirit, and even the whole world of its author alive and intact, while never dismissing the cartoon qualities we know and love. In essence, a timeless holiday classic from the past brought to new life by a timeless animated cast to create a new timeless holiday classic for the present and future. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you.